Hello everybody and welcome to our video discussing the topic of Change Request 13337 issued September 15th, 2023, covering the revised payment methodology for the Nursing and Allied Health Managed Care add-on payment. So for this agenda, we're going to be covering the background of the legislation and the final rule that led to CR 13337. We'll talk about different scenarios that apply in this change request. We'll give a summary of the final result that will come out of Change Request 13337, and then we're going to walk through the actual CR 13337 verbiage. Now what I want to mention here is the entire purpose of this YouTube video is to clarify what's going on with this change request, what you as providers should expect from this payment, and what I'm going to mention right up front. I'm going to mention this multiple times throughout this video. The final result of this change request is that your Nursing and Allied Health payment will be the same payment it would have been had none of the change requests past CR 2692 ever been issued. So we'll clarify that. We'll see examples of it, but that's what I want to stress multiple times. So first of all, let's head into the Section 4143 of the legislation, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. The first thing I want to mention, actually two separate things. These are the two only exceptions where you will not be receiving a Nursing and Allied Health payment based on CR 2692. The first is that this change request and this legislation, this change overall, only applies to calendar years 2010 through 2019. Now, I want to make this clear because we've had questions on this. This is a legislative change to something in the statute, and again, it only applies to 2010 through 2019, and we'll see one of the changes was to remove the cap. But again, as soon as the 2020 calendar year hits, the cap and all the original payment methodologies are still back in play. So this change only applies to calendar years 2010 through 2019. That being said, let's say you have a 6/30/20 cost reporting period, 7/1/19 through 6/30/20. The Nursing and Allied Health payment is based on a calendar year, so in that type of cost report, you're going to have two separate Nursing and Allied Health payments, and then they're prorated to meet that cost reporting period. So the first half of the cost reporting period would be based on 2019 rules, which again, this does apply to. The second half of that cost reporting period would be based on 2020 rules, which this change does not apply to. This is not something CMS themselves has the authority to do, to change. This is legislation, and it would have to go through Congress if they were trying to extend this past 2019. We've had that question a few times already, so I just wanted to stress that. The other big exception here is that this change only applies to hospitals that, as of 12/29/22, were still operating a Nursing and Allied Health program. If you have a Nursing and Allied Health program that you terminated or it was disallowed during audit as of that date, then it's going to be continued to be paid under the original rules from Change Request 11642 and all of the subsequent change requests, but we're not going to be applying the CR 13122 or this current 13337 rules. That means that your payment, if you don't have that Nursing and Allied Health program, you're still going to be getting those lower Nursing and Allied Health factors that came about in CR 11642, and you're going to be subject to that $60 million cap pool. So those are the two things I wanted to stress. Some of that will make a little more sense when we get into later sections here. So this act, the overall purpose of the act was initially to remove the $60 million cap from the calendar year 2010 through 2019 payments. And at the same time, they stated they will not reduce the GME payments to account for those additional Nursing and Allied Health payments. So to clarify that, what basically happened in 11642 was that the Nursing and Allied Health payments, those factors, were reduced in 11642. So that means that providers got less of a Nursing and Allied Health payment. The GME payment reduction was changed so that your payment reduction was less for GME. That means you received more GME payment. Less of a payment reduction equals more of a GME payment. Now, the reason these two normally go hand in hand is that statutorily, the GME payments were reduced to set aside funds to be able to pay the nursing and allied health add-on payment. That's how that was initially set up, and that's how it worked in change request 11642. One payment decreased, the other payment increased, although it wasn't a clean wash for any individual provider. But what I want to point out here is this legislation, it's providing additional nursing and allied health payments without a reduction, a further reduction to GME payments. So that was in the legislation. So what this means is those providers in CR 11642 that had a GME program, their GME payments increased, and we are not reversing that benefit through this change request. That was part of the legislation. So it's a beneficial situation for providers. It does not harm anybody. The other thing about that is that any nursing and allied health payments that were previously recouped under CR 11642 or the next two change requests, or amounts that would have been recouped if we had final settled or reopened under those CRs, those amounts are to be returned to providers. So let me stress what this means. Remember what I said earlier, the CR 2692 payments were actually more beneficial. This goes all the way back to the 2001 factor in that change request 2692. It was not updated for subsequent calendar years until change request 11642 came about. So it had never been updated, but once it was updated, it was determined that those later factors were actually reductions. They actually reduced the nursing and allied health payments. So if you had a payment under CR 2692, that would have been higher than the one we calculated under CR 11642, for example, and therefore when that change request came out a few years back, that resulted in a reduced nursing and allied health payment for those providers. This legislation is restoring that amount. It's returning the amount to what it previously was under the old CR 2692 levels. That's the heart of this change request, and I'm going to reiterate that multiple times to ensure there's no confusion. The little bit of confusion that does exist, however, is how we have to go through this calculation to get to that point. If you take a look at the federal fiscal year 2024 IPPS Final Rule that was issued on August 28, 2023, that final rule provides a four-step approach to ensure that those recouped nursing and allied health payments are returned to providers. Specifically, it's pages 59058 and 59. The other thing I want to stress here, and this was clearly stated in the final rule, is that this only applies to reopenable cost reporting periods, so those that are within the 3-year reopening period. Now, we already went through a reopening project back with CR 11642. Anything that could have been reopened, it was still within 3 years at that time, was reopened. And therefore it's still reopened because it was less than 3 years ago. We've already issued all the notices of reopening that are required for this project. Plus, of course, there might be newly settled cost reports that were settled under one of the change requests in between 11642 and now. It applies to those as well. And again, we've already issued the notices of reopening. There is no requirement for providers to request this. It's already in play. Now, there is a note that I want to point out to. I mentioned I would repeat this multiple times because it's so important, and here's one of those times. There's a CMS response to a public comment on page 59059. It specifically states, by returning the amounts previously recouped, the amounts would be consistent with the amounts calculated with the variables in place prior to the release of CR 11642. The only thing that existed prior to the release of CR 11642 was CR 2692, issued May 25th, actually I think it's 23rd maybe, of 2003. That was the last CR that existed, the only CR that existed prior to that. So again, just to reiterate, the final payment that we're going to be calculating is based on these old rules, the CR 2692, which is beneficial as compared with CR 11642 and the later CRs. Just wanted to stress that out because we've had a lot of questions on that already. Now here is the four-step approach. We're going to see this. I'm going to open up the final rule and point this out, but I wanted to summarize it right here, a little easier to see. The first step is pretty simple. Identify whether the hospital was indeed still, we're just going to say still active. They had to actively had a nursing allied health program as of 12/29/22. The verbiage in the final rule does talk about the fact that they had to still receive interim payments as of that date. But then if you go into the change request that we'll see a little bit later, there are certain exceptions in place because CMS realizes that, hey, a provider may have actually had an active program. Maybe the amounts were so small that they weren't factored into an interim payment, or maybe there were changes going about at the time. And again, for whatever reason, they hadn't been factored into that payment. And that's fine. Those are exceptions. Really, it boils down to, did you truly have an active program at that time? So that's the easy part there. Then we get to some of the confusion. Step 2 says, use this newly published table with the uncapped pool amounts, but the factors that existed, the same factors that existed in 11642. Use the newly published table in the final rule to calculate your current year 2010 through 2019 payment. However, it is key to note you cannot just stop here. You can't say, hey, this is what we're going to calculate. This is a four-step process. We have to continue on. Step 3 says, now let's figure out how was it calculated under CR 11642. Again, those would have been the same factors, but that would have been a 60 million capped pool. So subtract the CR 11642 payment from this uncapped payment in step 2. That's the only difference between step 2 and 3 is the cap. The factors themselves are exactly the same. The only exception, I guess, is 11642 only had up to, I think, 2018 factors. So obviously the other CRs have added the 19 and 20 factors. But besides that, the factors are the same. So step 3, subtract this payment from the other payment. And that's always going to be a positive difference because, again, this CR 11642 was a lower amount. It had a lower cap. So there's going to be a difference here. That's number 3. Number 3 is a difference between these two payment calculations. Step 4, take that step 3 difference plus the difference between that same step 3 and any amount previously recouped under 11642 or the later CRs, if the difference is greater than 0. Mathematically, that sounds a little confusing. Why are we adding something in only to subtract it again? But that's what CMS wants us to do, basically to reconcile, to show each of the 3 payments, essentially is what's happening here. It'll show what you would have been paid under 11642 with and without the cap pool amount, and ultimately what you would have been paid prior to CR 11642, which is 2692. In the end, the amount equals the amount calculated prior to CR 11642, which again is going to be higher than what was calculated under CR 11642. So in the end, we're using 2692 for the calculation. Another repeat of the exact same thing. Now I want to walk through a few different scenarios here. Oh, and by the way, before I do that, let's walk through the final rule. First of all, here is the table that I'm referring to. Notice that the pool numbers are no longer capped. They go all the way up to 140 million. They're all above 60 million by the time you get to 2010. These other factors, these national nursing and allied health factors and managed care factors, are the exact same as what you would have found in CR 11642, as well as the last couple of CRs that were issued for the new updates. I know it's going to be a bit hard to see, but here is the proof of that. On the right, I have the CR 11642 from back in August of 2020. Notice that went all the way down to 2018 years. So let's just take 2018 as an example. This, of course, the pool was capped at $60 million. That's the difference. But this fee-for-service nursing allied health national payments was $267,714,849, which is the exact same in our Federal Register. You can look at all of them if you want. They're all identical. The only exception is the fact that CR 11642 was capped at $60 million, whereas the Federal Register is not. It's the only difference there. So that's the table, and I wanted to point out the four-step process. Starts off on page 59058 of the Federal Register. It goes down here at about halfway through. It says, we propose that MACs would first determine whether they had initial payments, whether they're receiving interim payments. Then there's the second step. Use this table to calculate what they would have received without a capped pool. Third, that's that whole take the difference and compare that. And then there's the fourth step. So you can see it in black and white right here. I just summarized it in the actual PowerPoint. But right here is the key thing. We noted that by adding the difference to the amount calculated in the third step, the amounts previously recouped under CR 11642 would be returned to hospitals, and recoupments that would have occurred under CR 11642 if not for the enaction of this legislation would not occur. So that's the key thing here. Furthermore, down here at the bottom, this is in response to one of the public comments. By returning the amounts previously recouped, the amounts would be consistent with the amounts calculated with variables in place prior to the release of CR 11642. As I said, that means that this is being calculated under 2692. So that is the final rule version of it. Now, there are two scenarios, first of all, that we have to eliminate from this, and we already discussed this. The first one is if your cost report ends prior to 1110, that's too early, it doesn't have any of these factors in place, or if it begins after 12/31/19, then it's not part of this change. You're going to be paid under whatever factors were in place for those years. The pools for the later years are capped at $60 million. Barring any congressional legislation that might change this. And of course, basic scenario 2 is if the provider had their nursing and allied health program terminated or disallowed as of 12/29/22. In that case, none of these changes would apply. The pools would be capped at $60 million, and the same factors would be used. Basic scenario 3 is going to be our most common one. This assumes we're within the 2010 through 2019, and we have an active program as of 12/29/22. More so, it assumes, this most common scenario, it assumes that we've already final settled this cost report, or we reopened it and revised settlement under CR 11642 or those later two CRs. In other words, we have recouped nursing and allied health money. And furthermore, though, there cannot be a settlement under CR 13122 under this particular scenario. We'll see the rest of it later on. So under this most common scenario, where we've already recouped nursing and allied health money and we have not paid any of it back from CR 13122, that's where that four-step approach comes into play. We have to basically show the reconciliation of all three of those different calculations, basically to prove that, hey, CR 2692 is a higher payment. Even though we're using an old factor, old pool number, it's $43 million back in 2001. That's the pool number that's being used. Now, note, it's not capped. It's not at the $60 million. It's just the old original pool number. I want to stress that. And furthermore, we're using the old cost report data elements that existed in CR 2692, Although, of course, because those were the old 2552-96 hospital cost report form set, we obviously have to update those to the 2552-10 counterparts, but we have to use the exact same data elements. That's where another point of contention comes into play. There were some new data elements added in change request 11642 that did not exist at all in CR 2692. We're not talking about a translation type thing to the 2552-10 form set. We're talking these pieces, even though they were on the cost report, they were never included in the calculation of CR 2692. They were only added in when the new CR came into play. Because of that, we cannot include these elements in our calculation because they were not in the original CR 2692 calculation. Specifically, outpatient pass-through costs that are reported on D Part 4, column 13, those were not in existence in this CR. And labor and delivery days on S-3, line 32, they were not included in this CR. Let me show you the detail behind that. In the old 2552-96 cost report form set, labor and delivery days were found on line 29 of S-3. Line 29 is not referenced anywhere in the CR 2692 instructions. When we moved to the 2552-10 form set, those labor and delivery days were adjusted a bit to line 32. The very first time we see line 32 is in the CR 11642 instructions. Again, because our overarching instruction is that we have to calculate this under CR 2692 rules, we cannot include labor and delivery days. So here is an excerpt from CR 2692. Notice there is no reference whatsoever to S-3 line 29. Instead, it's just line 1, 6 through 10, 14 and 14.01, no reference to 29. Down in CR 11642, this is the first time they reference line 32 for labor and delivery days. Notably, that's just for the CMS 2552-10 form set. Even in this new CR, they did not bring in line 29 for labor and delivery days under the 2552-96 form set. So again, the point is, labor and delivery only appeared after 11642. It did not exist in the old CR, even though the cost report reported it. The next piece is the outpatient pass-through costs. CR change request 2692 required the use of D Part 4, line 101, column 7. And I have it highlighted down here. This is an excerpt. Column 7, by definition, is inpatient pass-through only. There's no reference to column 9, which is what reported outpatient pass-through costs. There is no column 9 in this instruction. If you notice, this is an excerpt from the old 2552-96 form set. Column 7 is inpatient. You can see that right here. Column 7, inpatient pass-through costs. Column 9 down here would be your outpatient ancillary service pass-through costs. There's no reference to that. So we cannot use outpatient pass-through costs in our calculation. The first time they were brought into play was CR 11642, and the new reference for outpatient pass-through is D Part 4, column 13. Column 11 is inpatient. We're obviously going to use that. Column 13 is outpatient, and we cannot use that for this calculation. We have confirmed with CMS this issue, and again, they confirm it. I mentioned I would be repeating this multiple times. It's the most important thing out of this change request, and you'll see it down here in the change request. The business requirement 13337.3.3 says MACs shall determine that ultimately the amount reported for an eligible provider on E Part A, line 53 is the amount computed or that would have been computed in accordance with CR 2692, and that in all circumstances, the maximum payment reported for an eligible provider is the amount computed or what would have been computed in accordance with CR 2692. Again, the absolute final payment that you're getting out of this CR 1337 is calculated completely using everything from CR 2692. Now, this CR 13337 gives us some other scenarios as well. And with these other scenarios, it's actually easier. We don't have to go through the four-step reconciliation. Instead, we go straight to the CR 2692 calculation. So the first scenario, and by the way, these are fairly rare. Number one, a hospital's cost report on worksheet E Part A, line 53, still reflects the original amount paid under CR 2692. In that case, just leave that amount, and we do not need to make any further adjustments. The only time this would ever come up is if a cost report was on hold for a very long time, at least since 2018, and we've never been able to settle it or reopen it or anything. Again, it should be pretty rare. There might be maybe a bankrupt hospital that's been on hold, or they've been on hold for some other reason. But the point is, if it's already under CR 2692, there's no need to make an adjustment. If the hospital cost report was reopened under CR 11642 but was not yet settled, so yeah, we reopened it, but we haven't revised the settlement. Again, that means for some reason it was on hold. Since it didn't truly get settled under that CR, there's no recoupment. In that case, we're still at the original amount under CR 2692 because we didn't adjust it, and there's no need to make further adjustment. We're where we needed to be. Number three, a hospital's cost report reflects 0 or blank on E Part A, line 53. In this case, basically CMS is saying we need to make sure or determine whether the hospital is eligible for this pass-through payment, regardless of the fact that they didn't report it. Are they eligible for it? And if so, then calculate the nursing allied health payment in accordance with CR 2692. Again, another repeat. If no, obviously we'll leave that as blank or 0. The thing I want to reiterate here is that under change request 11642, we already basically did this. We looked at all nursing and allied health hospitals to see whether they qualified, regardless of the fact it was reported as 0. So these would already have an amount if they did indeed qualify. Number 4, if a hospital's cost report was settled under CR 13122, which had the increased pool amount, then the MAC shall reopen that cost report and will ensure that the amount reported for the hospital is, guess what? The amount computed or what would have been computed in accordance with CR 2692. So this number 4, again, we don't have to go through the four-step reconciliation. We go straight to the CR 2692 calculation. But no matter what, in all cases except for those that are outside of 2010 through 2019 or the whole terminated program issue, the final amount will be calculated under the CR 2692 factors, pool number, and the data elements. That amount is going to be higher than what the provider was previously reimbursed under CR 11642 or those later CRs. So just as a summary here, the time frames. For previously settled cost reports, we are reopening these within 180 days of this CR 13337 issuance. So they're due by March 19th of 2024. And if it's a brand new cost report that's just now being final settled on or after this CR date, all of the regular time frames will apply. And again, the difference here is we don't have to do a four-step reconciliation because there was no recoupment made. It's straight to that CR 2692 payment. There's no reconciliation required. In the CR, there's even another repeat of what I've said earlier. For cost reports that are not settled, we'll implement the CR as part of the normal time frames. MAC shall apply the instructions in this CR to ensure that an eligible hospital is paid the full amount that would have been paid under CR 2692. So now what I want to do is walk through that actual CR 13337 verbiage, show you some of the important pieces. This can be found on the CMS website. You can, if you want to type in this link, or you can just do a search or even a Google search for CR 13337, maybe Nursing and Allied Health, add that afterwards, And this link right here is that. We're going to walk through that and see exactly what it looks like. So here it is over here. It's the exact same file you'll see on that website. It was 9/15/2023. There's a lot of background here to this. You can certainly walk through that. It explains the legislation, it explains the final rule. And then we get down to, this talks about what happened in 13122, which we started but then had to pause it as we were waiting on this new CR. Here's yet another verbiage, another piece of that repeat. As part of this methodology, cost reports initially settled under CR 11642 will be treated as though they had been originally paid under CR 2692. We're not touching the GME payments at all. They've already been increased in the prior CR, and you'll keep that higher amount. Here is that four-step process. First, determine whether they've received, whether they had an active program, essentially. Here is that whole exception about the interim payments that I talked about. You can certainly read that if you think it applies to you. And then, again, second, third, and fourth steps. Notice it does not specify, it gives a very generic calculation. It doesn't specify which cost report elements to use, but it does say we have to recalculate it under 2692, and we've confirmed that with CMS that we have to use the data elements that were in place at that time. Here's that fourth step that we already went through. They give a few examples here, and as you'll see with those examples, they all end up with exactly what they were calculated under CR 2642. This is the four other scenarios we talked about. How to handle the settled cost reports. And again, here it is again. The 2692 is what applies. Yet another time. This is the business requirement we talked about earlier. It says the exact same thing. Now, if we look at the end, so I said here that there's the attachment. Now, this is similar to what was in the Federal Register, only it stops at 2019 because that's all this change applies to. Again, these were, the cap was removed. The $60 million cap was removed. This attachment, however, is only needed for that step 2 of the calculation. This is not what your final calculation is going to be based on. This is step 2 of the 4-step calculation. To get, and here's the example here. Notice they tell us right here in this example, it's a 12/31/2017 cost report. Here is what they were paid under CR 2692 prior to CR 11642. This was before we started working on that project. It's $1.5 million. They go through this whole reconciliation, and then the new amount on line 53 is, guess what? $1,523,231. So that is the final amount. The other thing I wanted to mention here, so as far as 2692 calculation, we have to go back to the actual pool numbers from CR 2692, again, way back in May 23rd of 2003. Again, that's on the CMS website. You can read through that. You can find all the details. It's in a slightly different format than the newer CRs, but they give us the data elements, and these are the data elements that I just referred to, the D Part 4, the S-3, I gave you screenshots of those. That's where they give us all the data elements. And then they give us the pool figures down here. This original pool from CR 2642, the only pool that existed at that time until 11642 came into play, was $43 million. That's, again, the pool figure that we have to use for this calculation, and we have to use these other factors as well. That's where it all boils down to. Now, to make it easier, we have included some calculation forms on our website. So if you go to the WPS GHA website, and if you go down to the nursing, well, first of all in the audit section, then if you go to the nursing and allied health topic tag, we have a Nursing Allied Health add-on payment article. If you click on that, we have a little bit of a discussion of each of the different CRs, including links to the CRs. We have an overview of the CR 1337, the due dates, all of that. And by the way, I will be updating this YouTube video onto this link as well in the very near future, in the next couple days. But we also have a calculation, the Nursing Allied Health Managed Care Add-on Payment Calculation. If you click on this, this is what you'll see. Now, the first tab, the Input tab, helps you through identifying what potentially 3 years of cost reporting periods you need for this calculation. You obviously need the current year, and you may need 2 cost reporting periods. Well, they're referred to as the quote-unquote 2-year prior cost reporting periods. It's not as simple as just going back 2 years. There's a lengthy calculation that the regulations require. This helps you through those. So basically, to do that, to make sure that you get the right years, you have to enter the 6 most recent cost reporting periods prior to the current year. That way the formulas here can help you determine which of those cost reporting periods are the potentially two, that you need to calculate this. It'll walk through it. It'll give you some templates or some instructions here, and it'll summarize everything right here. It'll ask you to fill in the information for the current year. What do you need for that one? And then if you have calendar year 1 and possibly even calendar year 2 over on the right, this conditional formatting will change depending on whether or not you need that second year. But once you enter that, it'll prompt you through all of the different information. And again, and by the way, I have highlighted these particular cells. The version that's on the website, you won't see these 4 cells highlighted. I just did this for the purposes of illustration. But let me change this here real quick. So when you first download the form, it's going to give you all the data elements you need. I highlighted these 4 because these are the ones that change depending on whether you're trying to calculate it for this project or not. The L&D days, the column 13 outpatient pass-through costs. If you do want to calculate it to see what you're going to be getting under the old 2692 factors, you go down here and you enter a Y, and notice now it says NA for CR 2692 calculation. You would not want to put anything in these cells because it's not included. It does the same over here as well. It'll calculate the payment on these 2 tabs for you if you want to see the details of it. But what it's doing there, when you entered Y, it's only pulling the CR 2692 factors. Regardless of the year, we have to go back to the 2692 factors, including that pool. Remember, this is not a capped pool per se, because it's less than 60 million already. This is just the CR 2692 pool factor. These are the factors being used when you enter Y into this calculation. So that is really a summary of what this project is all about. This gives you links to the various CRs and Federal Registers if you'd like to see them. But again, that's what we're doing for this project. Hopefully this has helped to clarify that. I thank you for your time today, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video. Have a good one.